Stephen D. Richards was born on March 18, 1856, in Wheeling, West Virginia. He grew up with 5 sisters and 1 brother. When he was 6 years old, his family moved to Ohio, first to Monroe County and then to Noble County. Richard's mother was a devout Methodist, while his father, a farmer, did not profess any religious beliefs. On September 16, 1871, his mother passed away under mysterious circumstances. A few years later, at the age of 20, Richards became engaged to Anna Milhorn, with whom he maintained a correspondence during his later travels, even up to his final arrest. During this time, he also encountered individuals engaged in questionable activities and began passing counterfeit bills that he claimed to have obtained through a contact in New York. In February of 1876, he left Mount Pleasant with aspirations of finding fame and fortune out west. Richards initially resided in Iowa, working on farms in Burlington and Morning Sun. He later secured a position as an attendant at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, where he was responsible for burying the deceased patients. His time at the asylum, as reported by the New York Times, had a profound impact on him, shaping his perspective on humanity. Although he denied witnessing any abuse of the patients, he admitted that handling and disposing of the deceased patients led him to become desensitized, viewing people as little more than bodies. In October of 1876, Richards left the asylum and began wandering through the Midwest, taking on sporadic employment and occasionally associating with train robbers. He briefly stayed in Kansas City before moving on to Nebraska, passing through towns like Hastings before settling in Kearney for a few weeks. During his stay in Kearney, he claimed to have been involved in numerous gunfights, where he asserted that he shot each individual involved, though he was unsure of their outcome. Throughout this period, he adopted the alias William Hudson, one of several false names he would use in his lifetime. In a confession penned following his final apprehension, Stephen D. Richards admitted to the slaying of 4 individuals during his travels through Nebraska and Iowa in 1876 and 1877. His first recorded murder occurred in late 1876, approximately 2 weeks after he arrived in Kearney, Nebraska. During a chance encounter near Dobbytown, Richards and another traveler decided to camp for the night. They engaged in a card game, with Richards emerging as the dominant winner, amassing most of his companions' money. However, as they resumed their journey towards Kearney the next morning, the other man demanded the return of his money, growing increasingly hostile when Richards refused. In response, Richards fatally shot him above the left eye, and upon confirming the man's demise, disposed of the body in the Platte River. Several days later, while continuing his journey to Kearney, Richards crossed paths with another man approximately 15 miles from a location known as Walker's Ranch. The traveler had seen Richards in the company of the man he had previously killed, and he inquired about the fate of his friend. Richards, in a bid to avoid implicating himself, initially denied any knowledge of the deceased man. However, the persistent questioning by the deceased man's friend left Richard increasingly uneasy. Fearing that the man possessed knowledge of Richard's association with the murder victim, he decided to eliminate him to safeguard his secret. When the stranger turned his back, Richard shot him in the back of the head, ending his life. Richards concealed the body and sold the man's horse in a nearby town before continuing his journey. Before reaching Kearney, Richards halted at the residence of Jasper Harelson, whom he described as a notorious train robber. Mary, Jasper's outspoken wife, noticed blood stains on Richards' shirt. In a casual response, Richards joked that the blood must have come from the men he had killed, bringing their conversation to an end. Later on, Richards ventured to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he used counterfeit currency to purchase a horse and buggy from an unidentified seller. When the seller discovered the counterfeit money, he confronted Richards, demanding genuine payment or the return of his horse and buggy. Richards rejected both demands and, in response, shot the seller. He then buried the victim and left the area. In March 1877, Richards, accompanied by a young man named George, embarked on horseback from Grand Island, Nebraska, towards Kearney. They camped between Lowell and Kearney along the Platte River. An early morning dispute erupted when Richards attempted to rouse George, who was angered by the early awakening and began hurling insults at Richards. Their argument escalated, leading to George brandishing his revolver and making threats. Richards, fearing for his life, reacted swiftly and shot George in the head with his .33 caliber pistol. It was their first major disagreement. After departing the scene, Richards reached Kearney and registered at a local hotel under the alias F.A. Hodge. During his stay, he reunited with acquaintances George Henry Johnson, Hearst, and a man known as Mr. Burns. In June 1878, while residing in Kearney, Stephen D. Richards was arrested and incarcerated on charges of larceny. Richards vehemently maintained his innocence regarding this accusation. During his time behind bars, he had a reunion with Mary L. Harelson. Prior to Richards' arrival, Mary had been detained under suspicion of aiding her husband and another inmate, known as Underwood or Nixon, in escaping from the Kearney jail. During their shared confinement, Richard and Mary Harelson struck a deal. She agreed to sell him the deed to her property 6 months hence for the sum of $600. Upon his release from jail, Richards embarked on a journey through various regions of Nebraska, conducting business in Hastings, Bloomington, and Grand Island, before ultimately returning to the Harelson homestead in Kearney County on October 18, 1878. It was there that Mary Harelson officially transferred ownership of the property to Richards, and he resided there for several weeks. Approximately a month later, Richards made the horrifying decision to take the lives of Mary Harelson and her 3 children, 10-year-old Daisy, 4-year-old Mabel, and 2-year-old Jasper, affectionately called Jessie. In Richards' confession, he asserted that Mary Harelson had discovered his involvement in a murder, and he feared that her talkative nature might lead authorities to uncover his presence. In an effort to silence Mary and ensure the concealment of his prior crimes, Richards resolved to commit the gruesome act of wiping out the entire Harelson family. On November 3, 1878, Richards arose in the early morning, joined by another man named Brown, who had been staying at the Harelson residence. Brown left to tend to the horses and carry out farm chores. Seizing the opportunity, Richards procured a spade and dug a pit, then stealthily re-entered the house and brutally murdered Mary, Daisy, Mabel, and Jessie using an axe. Some accounts suggested that Mary and one of the children met their tragic end with a smoothing iron, while the others suffered physical assaults. Nevertheless, Richards refuted these alternative versions of events, affirming that he had taken the lives of the family while they were asleep. Most of them had perished after the initial series of blows, with the exception of Daisy, who endured agonizing pain for some time. Following the heinous act, Richards purportedly cleaned the blood from the floor and himself. He then proceeded to enjoy a calm breakfast. Subsequently, he carried the lifeless bodies out of the house and interred them in the pit that he had previously dug nearby. When questioned about the Harelson family's whereabouts, Richards informed several people that they had departed in the company of Brown, with no knowledge of their expected return. It wasn't until December 11th that the bodies of Mary Harelson and her children were discovered. Some reports indicated that they were concealed beneath a haystack, contrary to Richards' later claims that he had buried them. On December 9, 1878, Stephen D. Richards agreed to assist his neighbor, a 26-year-old immigrant from Sweden named Peter Anderson, with some tasks on Anderson's property. It was reported by the Columbus Journal that Richards used the alias Dick Richardson while working for Anderson. However, on that same day, December 9th, Anderson fell ill after consuming a meal that Richards had prepared for him. This led Anderson to harbor suspicion that Richards had intentionally poisoned him. Troubled by these thoughts, Anderson shared his concerns with the neighboring resident. The following day, Anderson confronted Richards about his suspicions, resulting in a physical altercation between the two men. The exact details of Anderson's demise differ in contemporary newspaper accounts. Some sources suggest Richards beat Anderson to death with a hammer or hatchet, while others claim that he shot him. Regardless of the method used, Anderson's lifeless body was later discovered concealed in the cellar of his own home, buried beneath a heap of coal. Richards vehemently denied any involvement in poisoning Anderson, asserting that such a method did not align with his typical actions. Instead, he contended that Anderson had attacked him with a knife and he had acted in self-defense. Following the murder of Peter Anderson, Stephen D. Richards made a hasty decision to flee Kearney. He anticipated the concealed bodies would soon be discovered, prompting his departure. As evening descended, Richards was in the midst of hitching up Anderson's horses and making preparations to depart when some of Anderson's concerned neighbors arrived at the scene. They had grown suspicious of Anderson's absence and questioned Richards about it. In response, he informed them that Anderson was inside the house. As Anderson's neighbors ventured into the dwelling, Richards quickly made his escape on horseback, riding towards Bloomington. His journey took him eastward, involving a combination of travel by horse, train, and foot. He passed through Omaha and Chicago, all while evading pursuit. During his time on the run, Richards crossed paths with Jasper Harelson and another fugitive who had escaped custody. Together, they embarked on a journey that led them through Wheeling, West Virginia, and into Ohio, traversing the town of Bridgeport, before reaching Richard's hometown of Mount Pleasant. On December 16, 1878, Nebraska Governor Silas Garber issued an arrest warrant for Richards and offered a $200 reward for his capture and subsequent conviction. Most historical records indicate that on December 20, 1878, shortly after Stephen D. Richards had arrived in Mount Pleasant, he attended a ballroom dance in the company of two unidentified women. It was a time when wanted posters bearing Richards' likeness had been widely distributed throughout the town. Constable McGrew, having recognized Richards from the wanted poster, took swift action. He enlisted the assistance of a penitentiary guard named Folge, both armed with shotguns, and set out to apprehend Richards. They encountered him walking through a field just outside of town, accompanied by two women. Richards, unarmed and perceiving their approach, quickly surrendered. Richards later recounted that upon spotting the approaching officers, he had initially contemplated on a confrontation and instructed the women to return to town. However, when the women refused to leave, he decided to surrender, sparing any violence. In his own words, Richards expressed that had the women departed, it might have resulted in a different outcome. He further explained that his plan, had he escaped, was to make his way to Nebraska, as he believed it to be the last place anyone would think to look for him. Following his arrest, Richards was initially incarcerated in Steubenville, Ohio. During his time there, he penned 2 articles for the local newspaper, confessing to 9 murders committed over a span of 3 years. Sheriff David Anderson of Buffalo County, Nebraska, and Sheriff Martin of Kearney County, both of whom had pursued Richards to Ohio, facilitated his return to Nebraska. Shortly before his trial, Richards anticipated his conviction and subsequent execution for his crimes. He was transferred to a jail in Omaha on December 28th and then transported to Kearney by train. On December 30th, a large agitated crowd gathered outside the Kearney jail, prompting authorities to take extra precautions to ensure Richard's safety and their own. While being moved to the depot, Richards was struck by the size of the crowd and inquired whether the entire town had turned out to witness his journey. Thankfully, the crowd eventually dispersed without any further incidents during his stay in Kearney. Richard's trial commenced on January 16, 1879, in Minden, Nebraska, under the jurisdiction of Judge William Gasling. District Attorney Schofield led the prosecution, while Richard's defense was in the capable hands of lawyer Savage. The charges against Richard included 2 indictments for first-degree murder, one for the slaying of the Harelson family and the other for the death of Peter Anderson. Richards entered a plea of not guilty, contending that he had acted in self-defense when he killed Anderson. In support of their case, the prosecution summoned 7 witnesses to testify, all providing accounts of the condition in which Anderson's body was discovered. Subsequently, Richards was called to the stand to give his testimony. Under questioning from Schofield, he admitted to causing Anderson's death with a hammer, emphasizing that he had done so in self-defense. Richards explained that, despite repeated warnings to the contrary, Anderson had attempted to reach for a nearby hatchet. As evidence, the prosecution introduced the hammer used in the killing, which Richards acknowledged as the murder weapon. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty for the murders of the Harelson family and Anderson. Richards received a death sentence by hanging, with his execution scheduled for April 26, 1879. Throughout the proceedings and his conviction, Richards maintained a demeanor described as cheerful and indifferent by onlookers. Following Richards' conviction, Sheriff Martin made the unusual decision to open up the execution in Minden to the public, despite apprehensions about a potentially unruly and large crowd. To mitigate the risk of a riot, an enclosure was constructed around the gallows to separate the expected spectators from Richards. However, admission tickets to the restricted area were sold, and Richards was permitted to invite individuals. Estimates of the number of spectators presented at the execution varied significantly, ranging from 2,000 to 25,000 individuals. At precisely 1 p.m., Richards was led to the gallows by Sheriff Martin and his deputy, which temporarily calmed the crowd. Upon ascending the gallows, Richards launched into a fervent defense of his actions. He reiterated his claims that he had acted in self-defense in Anderson's case and denied any involvement in the Harelson family murders. Richards asserted that he had been wrongfully convicted. He then declared that he had found solace in religion, having made peace with God and placing his faith in Christ. Richard's final words were reported as, "Jesus be with me now." Reverend W. Sanford G., who presided over the execution, expressed hope that Richard's professions of religious redemption were sincere, but admitted that they might not have been. At 1:15 p.m. on April 26, 1879, Richards was hanged. a process that the St. Louis Globe-Democrat claimed took 15 minutes for him to succumb to. Richards thus became the first person to be executed in Nebraska since its incorporation into the United States in 1867. Shortly after his execution, a photographer managed to capture an image of Richards' lifeless body positioned inside a coffin. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing by clicking the red subscribe button below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us. Please give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.